Sarah has never bought a bond in her life. Derek owns nothing but bonds. They're both about to lose money for the exact same reason, and neither of them will understand why until it's already happened. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people can explain what a stock is in one sentence. Almost nobody can explain what a bond actually does, and that single gap in understanding is quietly costing an entire generation of investors more than any bad stock pick ever could. Let's fix that today. Properly. With real numbers. Let's keep this fair and start with the basics nobody actually explains. A bond is a loan. That's it. You hand a company or a government your money, they hand you a piece of paper that promises two things. A fixed interest payment called a coupon, paid on a schedule, and your original money back on a specific date called maturity. Say you buy a 10-year bond with a face value of $1,000 and a coupon rate of 4%. You get $40 a year every year for 10 years. Then you get your $1,000 back. Simple. Predictable. Boring even. So why does almost everyone who owns a bond fund end up confused, sometimes angry, when they check their account and see a loss? Here's where Sarah comes in. Sarah keeps her entire six-figure portfolio in stocks because she was told bonds are for old people and boring returns. She's not wrong that bonds return less than stocks on average. She's wrong about what bonds are actually for, and we'll get to the cost of that mistake by the end. But first, Derek. In 2021, Derek did something that sounded responsible. He moved a large chunk of his savings into a long-term bond fund, the kind holding bonds that mature in 20 to 30 years. His advisor called it safe. The word safe is doing an enormous amount of lying in that sentence. Here's what nobody told Derek. Bond prices move opposite to interest rates, and the longer the bond, the more violently it moves. When interest rates were near zero in 2021, Derek's fund was full of bonds paying 2%, maybe 2.5% a year. Fine at the time. Then in 2022, the Federal Reserve raised rates aggressively from near zero to over 5% in about 18 months, the fastest hiking cycle in 40 years. Suddenly, brand new bonds were paying 5%. Nobody wanted Derek's old bonds paying 2.5% anymore, not without a discount. So the price of his existing bonds fell. Not a little. His long-term bond fund dropped about 25 to 30% in value through 2022. That's a safe investment falling nearly as hard as the stock market did that same year. Derek checked his statement and thought his advisor had lied to him. His advisor hadn't lied. His advisor had just never actually explained duration. Duration is the single concept that separates people who understand bonds from people who own them by accident. It measures how sensitive a bond's price is to a 1% change in interest rates. A bond with a duration of 7 will drop roughly 7% in price if rates rise 1% and rise roughly 7% if rates fall 1%. Short-term bonds maturing in 1 to 3 years might have a duration of 2. Long-term bonds maturing in 20 to 30 years can have a duration of 17 or higher. Same asset class, completely different risk. Derek didn't own bonds. Derek owned the single most rate-sensitive corner of the entire bond market, and nobody sat him down and told him what that meant before rates moved. Now here's the part that flips the story. While Derek's long bonds were getting crushed, short-term bonds barely moved. A bond maturing in 18 months with a duration near 1.5 might have dipped 1 to 2% in price during that same period, then simply matured on schedule and paid back in full. Same rising rate environment. Wildly different outcome. This is the first thing people miss. Bonds isn't one asset. It's a spectrum from cash-like safety to stock-like volatility, and where you sit on that spectrum changes everything. Let's go back to Sarah because her mistake is quieter, and it compounds differently. Sarah's all-stock portfolio did great in the good years. In 2023 and 2024, the S&P 500 posted strong double-digit returns, and Sarah felt like a genius for skipping bonds entirely. Then came a stretch of volatility. Say the market drops 20% in a matter of months, which has happened multiple times in the last 2 decades. Sarah is 58 years old and planning to retire at 62. She needs to start pulling money out in 4 years. If her entire $500,000 portfolio is in stocks and the market drops 20% right before she needs to start withdrawing, she's not looking at a temporary dip on a screen. She's looking at selling shares at a loss to pay her bills, locking in that loss permanently. This has a name. Sequence of returns risk. It's one of the few risks in investing that bonds are specifically, mathematically built to reduce, and Sarah never held enough of them to matter. Here's the number that makes this concrete. If Sarah had kept even 3 to 5 years of expected withdrawals, say $100,000 to $150,000 in short-term bonds or a bond ladder, she wouldn't need to touch her stock portfolio during a downturn at all. She could simply live off the bonds while she waits for stocks to recover. Historically, even severe market crashes have recovered within 2 to 4 years. A properly built bond allocation isn't about maximizing return. It's about buying yourself time, and time is the one thing that turns a stock market crash from a disaster into a delay. Let's talk about the sentence that gets repeated in every comment section under every bond video. Bonds are return-free risk. It's clever. It's also only half true, and treating it as gospel is exactly how people end up like Derek, holding the wrong kind of bond entirely. Bonds carry real risk. Interest rate risk, the one that hurt Derek. Credit risk, the chance the borrower doesn't pay you back, which is why a bond from the U.S. government pays less than a bond from a company with shaky finances. Inflation risk, where your fixed coupon payment buys less every year prices rise. These are real, and anyone telling you bonds are risk-free is selling you something. But dismissing the entire asset class because long-duration bonds got hurt in 2022 is like swearing off cars because you crashed one going 100 miles an hour down a mountain road. The tool wasn't the problem. The way it was used was. So, when do bonds actually earn their place, with real numbers attached? 3 specific situations. First, matching money to a timeline. If you know you need $30,000 in 3 years for a house down payment, a 3-year Treasury bond locks in that outcome with near certainty. As of recent years, short-term Treasuries have paid somewhere in the 4 to 5% range, meaning your money grows on a fixed, predictable schedule with essentially no risk of loss if held to maturity. Stocks can't promise you that. They can promise you more on average over decades. They cannot promise you a specific number on a specific date, and for money you need on a specific date, that distinction is everything. Second, dampening portfolio swings during the years, right before and after retirement. This is exactly where Sarah went wrong. A 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks and 40% bonds, has historically fallen far less during crashes than an all-stock portfolio, while still capturing a meaningful share of the long-term growth. During 2008, when the S&P 500 fell around 37%, a 60-40 portfolio fell closer to 20%. That gap isn't small when you're the one living off the account. Third, building a bond ladder for predictable income. This is a strategy almost nobody explains well. Instead of buying one bond, you buy several with staggered maturity dates, one maturing each year for the next 5 or 10 years. As each one matures, you either spend the cash or reinvest it at whatever rates are currently paying. This smooths out interest rate risk entirely because you're never forced to sell a long bond at a bad price. You just wait for it to mature on schedule the way it was always designed to. By the end of that volatile stretch, here's where our 2 characters land. Derek eventually sold his long-term bond fund near the bottom, converted the loss into cash, and missed the recovery when rates stabilized and bond prices climbed back. His mistake wasn't buying bonds. It was buying the most volatile version of bonds and expecting it to behave like a savings account. Sarah, after a rough few months of watching her all-stock portfolio swing wildly right before retirement, restructured into a mix, keeping several years of cash needs in short-term bonds and a ladder, and left the rest in stocks for growth. Her portfolio still grows. It just no longer has the power to ruin her retirement date based on the calendar of stock market crash. Here's the mental model underneath all of this, the one that actually matters more than any single number. A bond isn't a safe asset or a boring asset. It's a precision tool for controlling when you get your money and how certain that timeline is. Stocks are a bet on growth with an unknown timeline. Bonds are a promise about a specific timeline, and the price you pay for that certainty is a lower expected return. Neither one is the smart choice in isolation. The smart choice is knowing which job you're hiring each one to do. There's a 4th piece nobody mentions in the comment section debates, and it might be the most overlooked number in this entire topic. Credit risk. Not all bonds are created equal, and the coupon rate you're offered is basically the market telling you how worried it is that you won't get paid back. A U.S. Treasury bond, backed by the government, might pay 4.5%. A bond from a large, financially stable company might pay 5.5%, an extra percentage point for taking on slightly more uncertainty. But a bond from a company with shaky finances, the kind labeled high yield or, more honestly, junk, might pay 9 or 10%. That extra yield isn't a gift. It's compensation for real risk of default, and every year, a meaningful percentage of the riskiest issuers actually do fail to pay. Derek's mistake was duration. A different investor's mistake is chasing that flashy 9% yield without asking why it's so much higher than everything else on the shelf. In bonds, an unusually high yield is rarely luck. It's almost always a warning label. Then there's the risk almost nobody prices correctly, even people who think they understand bonds. Inflation. Say you buy a 10-year bond paying a fixed 4% coupon. For the first few years, inflation sits around 2 to 3%, and your real return, what you actually gain after prices rise, is a modest 1 to 2% a year. Reasonable. But if inflation spikes to 6 or 7%, the way it did in 2022, your fixed 4% coupon suddenly means you're losing purchasing power every single year you hold that bond, even though the payment on paper never changed. This is where Treasury inflation-protected securities, TIPS, earn their name. A TIPS bond adjusts its principal value with inflation, so the coupon payment rises and falls with the cost of living instead of sitting frozen. They typically pay a lower base rate than regular treasuries, often 1.5 to 2% lower, because that inflation protection is built in as a feature, not a bonus. For someone specifically worried about their fixed income getting quietly eaten by rising prices over a 20 or 30-year retirement, that trade-off is often worth every basis point it costs. Let's put a real number on what all of this actually means side by side, because the abstractions are where people lose the thread. Take 3 investors, each putting $100,000 into a single bond type and holding for 1 year during a period where rates rise 1%. The investor in short-term bonds, duration year 2, sees a price drop of roughly 2%, about $2,000, offset partly by the higher coupon they're now earning. The investor in long-term bonds, duration year 17, sees a price drop of roughly 17%, about $17,000, a genuinely painful swing for something sold to them as safe. The investor in TIPS, assuming inflation is the reason rates moved, actually sees their principal adjust upward with the same inflation that pushed rates higher in the first place, partially or fully offsetting the price hit. Same $100,000. Same rate environment. 3 completely different outcomes, entirely determined by a decision most people never consciously make, which corner of the bond market they actually bought. This is also where the phrase diversify with bonds stops being generic advice and starts being an actual decision. Diversifying with a total bond market fund means owning a blend of durations and credit qualities, smoothing out some of Derek's problem without eliminating it, because those funds still lean toward intermediate and long-term holdings. Diversifying with a bond ladder means you build the duration exposure yourself, on purpose, matched to when you'll actually need the money. Diversifying with TIPS means specifically hedging against the one risk that erodes every fixed income investor slowly and invisibly. None of these is universally correct. Each one is correct for a specific job, and the entire point of today's video is that most people buy bonds the way Derek did, based on a vague sense that it's the responsible thing to do, without ever asking which job they're hiring it for. So the next time someone tells you to just put some money in bonds without explaining duration, without asking what that money is actually for, without naming a timeline, ask them one question. What job is this bond doing for me? Because until you can answer that, you don't actually understand the asset. You just own it.